Okay, so evidence, like when you think about it, it seems like it should be pretty simple, right? Like you think fingerprints, DNA,
Yeah.
solid facts. But then you get into philosophy and, well, suddenly it's not so clear cut anymore.
Yeah, yeah. You'd think evidence would be like the most basic thing, but philosophers have been wrestling with it for, well, basically forever. I mean, Ayer even said philosophy was moving towards being like the study of evidence, but then you have someone like Collingwood who really struggled to even define it.
Yeah, it's almost like a clash of worlds. On the one hand, you have that everyday practical understanding of evidence, like you said, fingerprints, that kind of thing.
Mm.
But then philosophers come in and they start talking about like sense data and sensory experiences and propositions we know to be true. It's almost like saying a blood stain is the same as like a gut feeling.
Right, right. It's a bit of a strange comparison when you put it like that. So it makes you wonder, why the disconnect? Why do philosophers approach evidence so differently from, say, a scientist or a lawyer?
Yeah.
And even within philosophy, there are all these different theories about what evidence is.
Yeah, yeah. It's almost like uh, evidence is being asked to do a bunch of different jobs, and maybe some of those jobs even clash with each other.
Exactly. And that's what we're going to dig into in this deep dive. Given your philosophical background, we'll unpack some of the key roles evidence plays in philosophical thinking.
Okay, cool. Let's jump in. So the first big job evidence has is justifying our beliefs, right? Like I'm thinking of Kim here, how he said that a concept of evidence that doesn't tell us what we should believe, well, that's just not the concept we're actually using.
Yep.
It's fundamentally tied to justification.
Right, you've got to be able to do something with evidence. This takes us right to evidentialism. It's this idea, as Coney and Feldman nicely put it, that what you're justified in believing is ultimately grounded in your evidence. Your justified beliefs can't shift around unless the evidence you have changes.
So basically, your beliefs are only as good as the proof you've got.
Exactly. And if someone else has the same proof, they'd be just as justified in holding that belief.
This framing is really helpful when you look at some classic philosophical debates, like skepticism about the external world. That whole thing boils down to whether our experiences, the evidence we have right now, actually prove this world is real, or if it could all be some elaborate illusion.
Exactly. Or take the realism versus anti-realism debate in philosophy of science. That becomes a question of whether the evidence scientists gather is enough to justify belief in things we can't directly observe, like quarks or black holes, the really tiny stuff or the really far away stuff.
Now, I've always been curious about the connection between evidence and reason to believe. They seem so closely related.
Oh, definitely. They're practically synonyms. Reason, you can count, you have like two reasons for something. Evidence feels more like a lump of something, a
Right.
whole body of evidence. But yeah, they're pointing to the same basic idea.
Okay. But there's also this idea of total evidence,
Hmm.
right? It's not enough to just have one piece of evidence that points in a certain direction.
Right. Having one bit of evidence that suggests something doesn't mean you're home free. You could have other evidence that actually contradicts it or at least weakens it.
And that's where we get these defeaters.
Exactly. So you see a video of someone entering a building that seems like evidence they were there,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
But then you find out the video was edited. That new information undermines the original evidence. It acts as a defeater. And we can even break down defeaters further into different types.
Oh, right. So like the doctored video that weakens the link between the video and the person actually being there. But then there are other kinds of defeaters, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. Pollock distinguishes between undercutting defeaters and rebutting defeaters. The doctored video example, that's undercutting. It attacks the reliability of the evidence itself. A rebutting defeater directly supports the opposite conclusion. Like, say there's solid proof this person was miles away when the video was supposedly taken. That's a rebutting defeater. It directly contradicts the original claim.
Ah, I see. So it's like even if the video was real, this new information would prove they couldn't have been there.
Right. And the point is, justification isn't about just one isolated piece of evidence. It's about the entire picture. And that picture can change dramatically when new information comes into play, and sometimes even change back again.
Whoa, it's like epistemic whiplash or something.
Exactly. You can have defeaters for defeaters, so it becomes very complex. But this complexity is what makes it possible for us to be wrong, even when we're doing our best to follow the evidence. Because ultimately, justification hinges on the total evidence we have. And as you pointed out earlier, even figuring out what counts as your evidence is a whole other philosophical rabbit hole.
Yeah, that's a deep one. It's interesting, though, how our feelings about what should be justified, our intuitions, can actually influence our theories about what evidence even is.
Oh, absolutely. If we have this strong sense that someone in a particular situation should be justified in believing something, we're naturally going to favor a theory of evidence that allows them to have the right kind of support.
So it's like we're working backwards from our gut feelings about justification to figure out what evidence must be.
Yeah, kind of. Think about scientific hypotheses. How much evidence we think a hypothesis has, well, it's not just about the raw data. It can also be about the other possible explanations we're aware of. Like when Darwin's theory of evolution came along, it seemed to weaken the support for the design hypothesis, even though people were still looking at the same basic observations about the natural world.
Right, like just having a different explanation on the table changed how convincing the original one felt.
Exactly. And if you're an evidentialist, that suggests that somehow your evidence actually includes this awareness of other hypotheses.
Okay, so knowing about other ideas is part of my evidence. That's pretty wild.
It is, and it leads to interesting debates. Now compare this to Bayesianism. Bayesians definitely agree that evidence is crucial for rationally updating our beliefs, but they also give a big role to our initial beliefs, those hunches we start with. So two people with the same evidence in front of them might still end up with different justified beliefs, depending on their starting point.
So it's like where you begin affects where you end up, even if you follow the same path.
Precisely. For evidentialism, it's all about the evidence right in front of you. Bayesianism adds this extra layer. Your starting assumptions matter too in figuring out what you're justified in believing.
But evidence still plays a big role in how those beliefs change.
Oh, absolutely. It's just not the only thing.
Mm.
And then there's reliabilism, which in its purest form almost sidelines evidence altogether. It focuses instead on the reliability of the process that produced the belief.
So, if the way you arrived at a belief is generally trustworthy, it's justified, even if the specific evidence in this case is kind of shaky.
In theory, yeah. But then you have classic examples like the clairvoyant, someone who just reliably knows things without any evidence we can point to. And this makes even reliabilists think maybe evidence does have to play some role in justification after all. It's a tricky one.
Yeah. It seems like our intuition that evidence matters just won't go away.
It really is persistent.
Okay, so we've got evidence justifying beliefs. Check. But then there's this other role, right? The idea that rational thinkers respect their evidence.
That's right. It's practically baked into the definition of rationality, isn't it? That our beliefs should line up with the evidence we have.
Yeah. Like Ayer said, a rational person judges the strength of the evidence correctly. And Quine and Ullian talk about how rationality means changing our beliefs when they're not backed up by evidence. Even Hume said a wise person proportions their belief to the evidence. It's like everyone agrees.
They really do.
But of course, being rational doesn't automatically mean you're right. Like the evidence you have could be misleading, but as long as you're responding to it in a sensible way, you're still rational, even if you end up believing something false.
Definitely. It's possible to make a mistake without being unreasonable.
And this is where that whole evil demon thing comes in, right? The one Descartes came up with.
Yes. That classic thought experiment.
It's like, imagine someone stuck in this world where all their experiences are totally fake, all carefully crafted illusions. But if they're just as careful and thoughtful about their evidence as we are in the real world, are they less rational just because their beliefs happen to be false?
It's a great question, and it's led many philosophers to say, no, they're equally rational. But Williamson points out that this intuition, that rationality, looks the same in both the good case, our world, and the bad case, the demon world. It kind of forces us into a certain corner when we try to define evidence.
Oh, how so?
Well, if rationality is about reacting correctly to your evidence and the demon victim is still rational, then their evidence must be the same as ours, right? But the only thing that's the same in both situations is their internal experiences, their subjective mental states. So it seems like evidence has to be just those internal things, not anything about the external world.
So we're pushed towards this phenomenal conception of evidence, where evidence equals those internal experiences, feelings, whatever's going on in your head. Because that's the only thing that's guaranteed to be the same, whether you're being tricked by a demon or not.
Precisely. And this idea even gets support from the principle of charity. When we try to understand the demon victim, we're supposed to assume they're being reasonable given their evidence. So if they form beliefs about the external world based on those misleading experiences, well, that actually seems perfectly charitable. It means their internal evidence must be what's guiding their beliefs.
Yeah, that makes sense. It would be uncharitable to say they're just being stupid, right?
Yeah.
It's like, no, they're reacting reasonably to what they're experiencing, even if those experiences are fake.
Right. But Williamson actually challenges this whole line of reasoning. He argues that saying evidence has to be the same in both good and bad cases puts really strong limits on what evidence can be. It rules out, for example, evidence being true propositions, or even just our normal perceptions of the environment, because those would be different in each scenario.
It's like we're trying to define evidence so narrowly that it can't be different between those two worlds.
That's
But that might not be the right way to go about it.
Exactly. And Williamson even criticizes the phenomenal conception itself, arguing that we're not always in a position to know our own experiences with absolute certainty. So, this idea that evidence has to be something we can always be sure of, well, he calls it a chimerical desideratum, an impossible dream.
So we can't even fully trust our own experiences.
Oh.
That makes things even trickier.
Right. So, what's the alternative? Well, Williamson proposes that evidence is just all the propositions we know to be true. And this has a big impact on how we understand the good case versus the bad case.
Okay, so instead of focusing on feelings, it's about what we know.
Exactly. And in the good case, the person knows a whole lot more, and therefore has a lot more evidence than the person in the bad case.
So even though their beliefs might look similar on the surface, the person in the good case is actually being more reasonable because they have this whole foundation of knowledge supporting their beliefs.
Precisely. It's like, yeah, they both believe there's a table in front of them, but one person has a ton more justification for that belief because they know a lot more about tables, perception, the world in general.
But doesn't that make the demon victim's beliefs just flat out unreasonable? It seems like we want to say they're making a mistake, sure, but an understandable one. Can Williamson's view really account for that? If their evidence is just this limited set of knowledge within their fake world, what justifies all their beliefs about the external world if they don't even truly know anything about their own senses?
That's a really sharp observation. It's a major challenge for Williamson's account. And it suggests maybe we need a more flexible understanding of evidence, one that maybe includes both our experiences and our knowledge without being so strict about what has to be the same in the good and bad case.
Okay, so maybe it's not an either. Maybe it's both.
Possibly. And this brings us to the distinction between first-order evidence and higher-order evidence.
Okay, I think I remember this from epistemology class. First-order evidence is like directly about the thing we're interested in, right? Like weather data is first-order evidence for whether it's going to rain.
That's right. So what's higher-order evidence then?
Well, let me think. It's evidence about the first-order evidence or about how we're responding to it, right? So like if a meteorologist looks at that weather data and says, yep, it's going to rain, that conclusion is higher-order evidence.
Exactly. It's evidence that the first-order evidence, the data, actually supports the conclusion. And for someone who doesn't understand weather patterns, the meteorologist's conclusion could even act as a kind of replacement for looking at the data themselves. It's like, I trust this expert, so their conclusion is good enough for me.
That makes sense. But this gets tricky, right? Like, if another meteorologist comes along, looks at the same data, and forms their own opinion, is the first meteorologist's opinion also evidence for the second meteorologist? Or is that just counting the same thing twice?
It's a great question. Figuring out when higher-order evidence actually becomes evidence for the original proposition is something philosophers are still debating. It raises these interesting questions about when we should be swayed by what others believe about our evidence. Like, when should I adjust my beliefs based on what you think of my evidence?
Yeah, that gets meta fast.
It really does.
Okay, so we've looked at evidence as justifying belief and as something rational thinkers respect. Now, what about evidence as a guide to truth, like evidence as a sign or a symptom of something else?
That's another major role for evidence. The idea is that if E is evidence for H, it makes H more likely to be true. Verification and falsification, those are just the extreme cases. And of course, some things just seem true in themselves, like 2 plus 2 or 4. We don't really need evidence for that the way we need evidence for, say, the shape of the Earth.
Right, and this brings up the whole question of how directly we access reality. Like Austin had this famous line about seeing a pig versus having evidence for a pig. Common sense says, hey, you just see it right. But epistemology often says, even in those seemingly direct cases, we're still relying on our sensory experiences as evidence.
Exactly. Evidence acts as this intermediary, this bridge between us and the world, especially when we're trying to figure out truths that aren't immediately obvious. Like Blanchard said, the goal is to believe no more, but also no less than what the evidence warrants. And this connection to truth, I think, is what underlies why evidence can justify belief and guide rational thinking.
Makes sense. But it seems like evidence that's made up of facts or things we know are true, that's going to be a more straightforward guide to truth, right? because disagreeing with that kind of evidence would mean disagreeing with reality itself. What about evidence as beliefs or experiences? That connection to truth seems less clear-cut.
Right. And that's where Hacking's idea of evidence of one thing that points beyond itself comes in. It's evidence as a reliable sign or symptom, like smoke indicating fire or Koplik spots being a sign of measles. The connection here is one of correlation. These two things reliably go together, and this view is pretty broad. It allows for both mental states and physical objects to be evidence.
Okay, so when we say Koplik spots are evidence of measles, that's basically an empirical discovery, right? That relationship exists whether or not we know about it.
Exactly. But we need background knowledge to actually use that evidence to figure out new stuff. Like, someone could see Koplik spots and have no idea they indicate measles. In that case, even though the spots are indicator evidence, they're not what we'd call normative evidence for that person.
Okay, hold on. So there's a difference between just indicating something and being the kind of evidence that justifies belief.
Right. The spots indicate measles, that's just a fact about the world. But for that to be evidence that justifies a doctor's diagnosis, the doctor has to know about that connection. The spots are the indicator. The knowledge makes it normative evidence.
So it's like the same thing can be evidence in different ways depending on what you know.
Exactly. And this idea of normative evidence, the kind that justifies belief, it might actually be a three-place relation. E is evidence for H relative to some background knowledge, T. Like, my knowledge that Koplik spots mean measles, that's the background knowledge that turns seeing those spots into actual evidence for measles for me.
Ah, I see. Without that background knowledge, the spots are just spots. They don't mean anything specific.
Precisely. But this immediately brings up the question, what's the status of that background knowledge itself? Does it have to be knowledge for sure, or could it just be belief or justified belief? And this is where confirmation theory, particularly the work of Hempel and Carnap, really gets interesting.
Well, right. They were all about trying to make this relationship between evidence and theory super precise. Like, when does evidence support a hypothesis and how much support does it give?
Exactly. They distinguish between confirmation, just the basic idea of evidence supporting a hypothesis, and the degree of confirmation. And their work really set the stage for the rise of Bayesianism, which brings in probability to analyze evidence.
So instead of just saying, this supports that, Bayesians say, this makes this much more likely.
Exactly. For Bayesians, E is evidence for H if the probability of H being true given E is higher than the probability of H being true on its own. Like the classic example of finding a bloody knife. That makes it more likely that the person holding the knife committed the crime.
It's like the evidence shifts the odds in favor of the hypothesis.
Right. Though, of course, even this probabilistic model has gotten some pushback. Attenstein and Goodman came up with some clever thought experiments that raised some doubts. But still, the probabilistic approach is super influential, especially in philosophy of science these days.
Yeah, it's hard to get away from probabilities when you're talking about science.
True.
Okay, so we've got justification, rationality, and truth. What's the last big job for evidence?
Well, there's this crucial role of evidence as a neutral arbiter, something objective and public that can help us reach agreement, especially when we have different opinions.
Ah, so this is about objectivity and consensus, like how evidence can help us move towards a shared understanding of the world.
Exactly. The idea is that objectivity means following the evidence wherever it leads, and this should, ideally, lead to convergence, to everyone coming to agree. And we see this play out most clearly in the natural sciences, where there's generally much more consensus than in other fields.
Yeah, it's like scientists from all over the world can come together and agree on the basic facts because they're all looking at the same evidence.
Right. And evidence plays this central role as an impartial judge when there are competing theories.
Which brings us to this classic phrase, the priority of evidence to theory. Although that can be understood in a few different ways, right?
Absolutely. It's definitely not about just gathering data randomly before you have any ideas. In reality, our theories guide where we even look for evidence in the first place.
Right, like you need some kind of framework to even know what to pay attention to, what questions to ask.
Exactly. And it's also not about the meaning of our scientific terms being totally determined by observations, like the logical positivist thought. That whole idea has, well, it's pretty much been abandoned. What seems most plausible is this idea of epistemic priority. It's saying that the justification for our theories ultimately rests on the evidence, but the observations we make don't depend on our theories in the same direct way.
So the priority of evidence doesn't mean you go out and collect facts randomly and then try to make a theory out of them. It's more like when we're trying to decide whether an idea is good, The evidence is what matters most, not how clever or elegant the idea itself is.
Exactly. This epistemic priority seems really important for evidence to function as a neutral judge between different theories.
Because if the evidence itself was shaped by the theory, it wouldn't be very neutral, right?
Exactly. But of course, things get more complicated when we consider how the significance of evidence can be influenced by our background knowledge, right?
Yeah, yeah. Like disagreements that come from having different background knowledge, those can often be resolved by getting more information. But a bigger problem comes from this idea that the impact of evidence might be shaped by stuff that's not rationally debatable. Like Kuhn talked about scientific paradigms, and in Bayesian reasoning there are those initial probabilities, and these things can all make the evidence seem less objective.
Right. This kind of relativity to things like paradigms or priors can make the evidence seem less like a neutral judge and more like something subjective. And while Bayesians have this idea of swamping of priors, where if you have enough shared evidence, those initial disagreements will eventually fade away, the significance and effectiveness of this washing out, it's still debated.
And then there's this even more radical idea, this theory-ladenness of observation. It's the idea that there's actually no totally neutral way to even describe the evidence.
Ah, yes. Hansen had those famous examples like the difference between a layperson and a physicist looking at an X-ray tube. They might literally see different things. And if even our perception and description of the evidence is shaped by our theories, that really limits evidence's ability to act as a neutral arbiter.
Yeah, if we can't even agree on what we're seeing, how can we use it to settle disagreements?
Right.
Yeah.
But it's important to note, this isn't the whole story. I mean, theories do sometimes get overturned by evidence, even by the people who originally believed in them. So evidence clearly has some power, even if it's not perfectly neutral.
So if evidence is supposed to help different people reach agreement, what does that tell us about what kind of thing evidence needs to be? Like that phenomenal conception where evidence is all these private mental states that seems to clash with the need for evidence to be public.
Absolutely. If evidence is going to lead to consensus, it needs to be out in the open, something multiple people can access, like physical objects, events you can witness, that kind of thing. Boyle really emphasized this idea of collective witnessing in scientific experiments, and Hempel talked about how scientific evidence has to be publicly testable.
It's like if you're the only one who can access the evidence, it can't really function as this shared foundation for agreement.
Exactly. And even Carnap, he originally thought sense data, these private mental things, were the foundation of science, but then he shifted to talking about public objects as the basis of these things called protocol sentences. And this was driven by the need for science to be intersubjective, for everyone to be able to check each other's work.
So even Carnap, who started out focusing on the inner world, realized that science needs something more external, more shared.
He did. But then, of course, there are other perspectives. Like Austin argued that basically any kind of statement can be evidence for any other kind of statement depending on the circumstances. And Williamson, with his broad view of evidence as everything we know, well, that includes both theoretical knowledge and introspective knowledge.
So maybe we shouldn't be so quick to rule out private internal things as evidence.
Perhaps not. And Goldman even argues that rejecting introspection as evidence doesn't fit with how cognitive science actually works. I mean, if we're going to study the mind scientifically, we have to take into account people's reports about their own mental states. And if scientific evidence needs to be intersubjective, well, then introspection has to count.
Yeah, and think about simple stuff like having a headache. My feeling of a headache, that's pretty good evidence that I have a headache, even if no one else can experience it. It seems like a mistake to say that's not real evidence.
Exactly. So we're left with this tension, this push and pull between evidence as something that creates shared agreement, which points towards publicity, and evidence is the thing that justifies belief, which might sometimes be rooted in private internal access. And you see this tension play out really clearly in behaviorism, which tried to explain everything in terms of observable behavior and downplayed the importance of introspection.
It's like behaviorism was trying to force all evidence to be public, but maybe that's just too restrictive.
It might be.
Okay, so to wrap things up, we've been on this deep dive into evidence, and it turns out it's not as simple as it seems. It's this multifaceted concept that philosophers have asked to do a lot of heavy lifting. Justify belief, guide rational thought, lead us to truth, and be this neutral foundation for agreement.
And as we've seen, those different roles can sometimes be in tension with each other, which helps explain why there are so many different theories about what evidence is. It seems like there isn't one simple universal answer to the question, what is evidence?
Yeah, and even figuring out what counts as my evidence, that's a whole other can of
It
worms.
really is.
So here's a final thought for you, our philosophically minded listener. Out of all the different roles we've talked about, which one feels the most fundamental to you? Like, what's the core essence of evidence? And is finding one single definition even the right goal? Or is evidence just too messy and context dependent for that?
And how do your own philosophical commitments shape how you understand evidence? What makes something count as good evidence for you? These are great questions to keep thinking about.
Yeah, because this deep dive has really only scratched the surface. If you want to go deeper, well, there are whole areas of philosophy dedicated to this stuff, like philosophy of science and epistemology.
Exactly. So keep exploring, and who knows what other insights you might uncover.
And with that, we'll wrap up this episode of The Deep Dive. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for having me.